The forest didn't care that Thomas Cade's heart was broken. It creaked, sighed, and whispered just the same. Wind moved through tall pine and fir trees like water over stone, and the snow, ever falling this time of year, softened the world, until it felt like walking through a dream. The woods didn't speak of grief or memory. That was the appeal. That's why he stayed. Thomas lived alone in a small log cabin nestled in the remote northern reaches of the Arizona Territory. The nearest town, Greystone, was over 2 hours by horse in good weather, and no one made the trip in the dead of winter unless they were desperate or dying. Thomas had built the cabin himself, years before, with his wife Clara. Back then, it was a hopeful place, filled with laughter, the scent of bread baking, and the rustling of pages, as Clara read by Firelight. Now it was quiet, too quiet, most would say. But Thomas preferred it that way. Each day followed a rhythm: rise before dawn, stoke the fire, feed the mule, chop wood, haul it down to the sled, hunt if needed, fix what broke. At night, he'd sit by the fire, a book in hand he barely read, and listen to the wind knock softly at the shuttered windows. If it was particularly cold, he'd take out the shawl Clara had knitted the winter before she died. Sometimes he'd hold it close, smell it, even then curse himself for doing so. Clara had died giving birth. The child didn't survive either. A double grave sat under the large cedar behind the cabin, marked by 2 rough stones and a wooden carving Thomas had whittled in a fevered storm of grief. He hadn't left the forest since. Not truly. He'd gone into Greystone once the following spring, sold lumber, bought supplies, nodded at condolences he didn't want. But every trip after that became shorter, more distant. He didn't need people, not anymore. The forest, he told himself, was enough, and in a way, it was. He knew its sounds, its moods, the groan of trees in heavy snow, the chirp of birds that stayed through winter, the howl of wolves far off at night. He could track a deer by a single snapped twig, tell how deep the freeze was by how the ice cracked underfoot. The solitude had become a second skin. That particular morning, the sun never broke through the clouds. Snow fell in lazy spirals, thick and fast, muting the world even more than usual. Thomas, dressed in Layer's bearskin coat, wool gloves, oilskin hat tanned, trudged into the woods with his axe slung over his shoulder. He had a few more logs to fell before nightfall, and though he had enough chopped wood to last 2 weeks, he didn't like to be idle. He moved deeper into the woods, following a familiar trail down past the frozen creek. His breath steamed in the air. Birds were quiet. The hush was profound. Then he saw something strange. It wasn't movement. Exactly. It was the absence of the forest's natural texture and odd shape, a break in the snow's smooth layer. He slowed, heart thudding, not out of fear, but from instinct. When he stepped closer, his breath caught bodies, 3 of them, lying crumpled together beneath a fallen pine bough, nearly buried in snow. For a moment, he thought they might be dead by then. A flicker of motion, a hand, a shallow breath, a whimper. They were women Apache, by their clothing and features. Young one looked barely more than a girl. Their skin was blue-tinged, hair frozen stiff, limbs curled tight against the cold. Thomas dropped to his knees, already shedding his coat. He didn't think there was no time. He wrapped them in furs, one by one, then began hauling them toward the cabin. 2 slung across his shoulders, one cradled in his arms. He'd return for the wood later, or not at all. Firewood didn't matter now. They were still alive, barely, and whatever their story was, they didn't deserve to die alone and frozen in the snow. Thomas Cade had never carried so much and so fast in his life. The snow was knee-deep in places, the cold biting through his gloves as he stumbled back toward the cabin with the 3 women in contrast, half frozen and frighteningly still. His breath came in sharp gasps, clouding the air like smoke from a dying fire. His back screamed under their combined weight, but he pressed forward. He didn't look down at them. If he did, he might see death in their faces, and he wasn't ready for that. Not again. He kicked the door to the cabin open with a frozen boot and hurried them inside, one at a time. The sudden burst of warmth from the hearthlight hit his face like a slap. Inside, it was just above freezing. He'd let the fire die down while he was out, but there was enough heat to fight the cold. "Come on," he muttered. "Stay with me." He set them down gently on a bed of blankets near the hearth. First, the oldest probably in her 20s. Then the other 2. One looked perhaps 18, the other even younger. All wore traditional Apache tunics, leggings, and thin moccasins entirely insufficient for a snowstorm. Their faces were gaunt, wind-burnt, lips cracked and blue. Frost coated their braids like salt. Thomas moved on instinct. He stripped off their wet clothing carefully, only what was necessary, and wrapped each of them in dry wool and buffalo furs. He wasn't shy, but he was respectful. This wasn't about modesty. It was about survival. He layered more blankets on top of them, then piled kindling onto the fire until the flames licked high and hot. They didn't stir. He felt for pulses one by one at the neck, the wrist, weak, but there. Thank God. He boiled water, brewed tea with pine needles and dried berries. sliced strips of venison, and laid them by the fire to thaw. Then he sat beside them in silence, listening to the storm still clawing at the cabin walls, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 3 Apache women, out here in the middle of nowhere. In the dead of winter, he'd seen war parties ride through the region during the conflicts a few years ago. But those days had mostly passed. The government had secured much of the territory, pushing the tribes onto reservations, though most folks knew secured was just another word for taken. But these women didn't look like warriors, they looked like survivors, and they were so young. He looked at the eldest, her features were sharp and proud, even in sleep. A faint scar ran down her jawline. She'd likely seen more of life than he had. Her arm twitched slightly under the blankets, as if still fighting something in her dreams. The middle one had a softer face, more delicate. She breathed the most steadily of the 3, a healer, perhaps, or a sister, and the youngest, barely a teenager, curled up like a frightened animal, fists clenched tight, jaw locked even in unconsciousness. She couldn't be older than 14. He wondered what had happened to them, where their people were, how they ended up half buried in snow, miles from any visible trail or village. Were they escaping something? Someone? The questions circled in his mind, but there was no one to answer them. Outside, the wind howled louder, pushing against the shutters like it wanted in. But inside, the fire grew stronger, flickering golden light across the wooden walls. The room smelled of smoke, fur, pine tea, and something else now, life returning. Hours passed. The oldest woman stirred first. Her eyes cracked open, piercing, and immediately alert. She didn't move much, just enough to realize she wasn't in the snow anymore. Her gaze darted to Thomas. Their eyes met. He raised his hand slowly. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're in my home." Her brow furrowed. She didn't understand the words, but she understood tone. She glanced down, saw the blankets, the fire, her 2 companions breathing beside her. Her expression softened, but only slightly. She didn't speak, just stared at him, wary and exhausted. Thomas nodded. "Rest, we'll talk later." He leaned back, giving her space. She didn't take her eyes off him, not for a second. By morning, the storm had buried the world in silence. Snow clung to the windows like thick frostbite. Outside, everything was white and still. But inside the cabin, life stirred in fragile pulses. Like a flickering flame in a deep cave, Thomas sat near the fire, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, rubbing warmth back into his aching fingers. The cabin was crowded now, no longer the cold, quiet sanctuary it had been. The women lay bundled on the floor beside the hearth, their bodies still, breaths shallow, but present. They were alive. That was more than he'd dared hope the night before. The eldest, whom he'd taken to silently calling the leader, had woken a few times through the night. Her eyes tracked every movement he made, full of suspicion, but not fear. She hadn't spoken, not a word, not even a whisper. The middle one, the gentle-looking one, had murmured in her sleep, soft phrases in Apache that Thomas didn't understand. She seemed calmer, less guarded. He'd caught her reaching toward her younger companion in sleep, as if to comfort her, and the youngest had yet to open her eyes. Thomas had done what he could. He'd boiled water and slowly trickled it into their mouths. Little by little, he'd laid hot stones near their feet to bring back circulation, then carefully massaged their fingers to keep the frostbite at bay. He rotated their bedding through the drying rack above the fire to keep them warm and dry. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He didn't sleep. Not really. His mind raced all night. What if they were being tracked? What if the soldiers came looking? What if this was a trap? But every time he looked at their faces, raw with cold and bruised by the wind, the doubts melted. These weren't enemies. These were victims of the land, of the weather, maybe of worse, and for now, they were his responsibility. By midday, the middle woman awoke. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the dim light. When she saw him, she jolted slightly, but he didn't move. He just nodded once and handed her a steaming tin cup of pine tea, miming the motion of drinking. She hesitated, then took it in shaking hands. Her voice cracked as she whispered something in Apache, soft and uncertain. He didn't understand, but he caught the rhythm of gratitude in her tone. "You're welcome," he said, quietly. She drank, wincing at the heat. Then, carefully, she looked down at the youngest girl lying beside her. She reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The girl didn't stir. A soft whimper escaped her lips. Her hands trembled. Thomas knelt nearby and gently pointed to the girl, then made a motion with his hands to ask, "Sister." The woman stared at him, confused. He tried again. "Sister," he said aloud, tapping his chest, then pointing between them. Understanding clicked in her eyes. She nodded slowly. "Tyla," she whispered, placing a hand on the girl's forehead, then touching her own chest. "Nita," he repeated, gently. "Nita, Tala, and gestured to the sleeping leader. And Nita's lips pressed together. She hesitated, then said, "Ayana." "Ayana," he repeated. He didn't give them his name. Not yet. He didn't want to startle them. Let them wake. Let them rest. Over the next 2 days, recovery began in cautious, unspoken rhythms. Nita spoke the most, though her English was sparse and broken. They communicated in gestures, nods, and small acts of trust. She understood yes and no, and eventually began to ask simple things. More tea, fire, good Tala hurt. Tala, the youngest, awoke on the third day with a scream. It tore through the cabin like a lightning strike, sudden and feral. She thrashed in the blankets, eyes wild, fists clenched. Thomas stepped back instantly, hands up. Nita rushed to her, murmuring words in Apache, stroking her hair until the panic faded. Tala stared at Thomas like he was a ghost, a threat, something monstrous. She didn't speak for hours later. Thomas heard her crying into Nita's arms. By the fourth day, Ayana spoke, just once. Thomas had stepped outside to split kindling. When he returned, Ayana was sitting upright, eyes locked on the door. As he set down the wood, she said one word, low and firm. Why? He turned. Why? What? Why help? He met her gaze, steady, honest. Because I know what it's like to lose someone, he said. Ayana didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. In the days that followed, the cabin became less like a shelter and more like a strange, fragile ecosystem. For people, for lives, for stories, none of them could fully tell yet they tried. In gestures and glances, in actions more than words. It started with firewood. Thomas was splitting logs outside when Nita quietly appeared beside him, her arms wrapped tight against the cold. He offered her a blanket, but she shook her head and pointed to the axe. He hesitated. You want to help? She mimed the motion of splitting wood. He chuckled. You're tougher than I am. She smiled small, quickened then, without asking again, grabbed a smaller hatchet from the stump. She wasn't strong, but she was precise. He adjusted her grip once, gently, not touching her hands, just pointing. She nodded. They worked side by side for an hour, saying nothing. That night, she brought in the kindling, carefully stacked it, and offered him a crooked little grin. Progress. The next day Ayana emerged. She still didn't speak much, but her eyes were different, less guarded, more watchful than wary. She moved with purpose, scanning the tree line like a hawk, pacing around the cabin perimeter. Thomas watched her from the porch as she studied tracks in the snow, bent down to examine broken brush, checked the sky. She was checking for threats, and learning him, back inside. She approached him and pointed to his shotgun leaning near the door. Her voice was flat. You use this? He nodded. For food. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not for us. No, he said, firmly. Never. She stared at him long and hard before giving the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Then she pointed to the rifle again and said a single word in Apache. He didn't know what it meant, but he repeated it. She smirked faintly. Wrong, she said, and corrected him. That was their first lesson. From then on, words became barter. He would teach them the names for things in English: fire, water, wood, deer, sky, and in return, they'd give him the Apache words. It was slow and awkward, but it worked. They wrote in the dirt, in ash on the hearth, and even on scraps of old newspaper Thomas had saved to start fires. Tala, the youngest, kept her distance at first. She refused to speak to him, often retreating behind Nita, arms crossed tight, eyes fierce, but she listened. He could feel it. She heard everything. Then one evening, after a silent meal of boiled rabbit and dried berries, Thomas sat near the fire, carving a small toy horse out of leftover cedar. It was something he'd done often years ago for the child that never came. He didn't think. He just carved. Tala crept close, watching. He looked up, didn't speak. She edged nearer, without a word. He handed it to her. She took it, examined it carefully, then muttered something in Apache he didn't catch. Nita translated softly from the corner. She said, "It looks alive." Thomas smiled. Good. That's how it should be. Tala didn't smile back, but she clutched the toy close to her chest and didn't let go of it for the rest of the night. As the snow began to lighten and the sun peeked through the treetops more often, the cabin transformed. It was still small, still crowded, but now there was sound, murmured words, soft laughter, even the occasional disagreement. They learned from each other in strange, beautiful ways. Nita helped Thomas repair the roof, teaching him how to braid bark cords for waterproofing. Thomas showed Ayana how to use a Western compass, then watched her toss it aside and navigate with the stars and trees instead. Tala finally spoke to him directly one morning. She said, quietly but clearly, "You chop wood, like deer run from wolf." He blinked. That's not a compliment, is it? She grinned for the first time, and then, one evening, after a quiet supper and a long, slow conversation about clouds, what they were called, how they moved, Diana looked at him and asked, "Why you live here, alone?" Thomas hesitated. He stared into the fire. Then said softly, "Because there was nothing left for me anywhere else." Ayana nodded. She understood that far too well. The cold had begun to retreat, just slightly. Like a wolf pulling back into the trees, but winter was far from over. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had shifted. The air no longer felt so still, so empty. There was movement now. Ayana had claimed the corner near the door, close to the weapons. Nita slept closest to the hearth. Tala still kept to the loft above, watching everything below, like a sentinel, and Thomas, He tried to remember how to live with people again. Some days were easy. They would work together in silence, cleaning hides, sharpening blades, preparing meals. Other days were more tense. Tala might flinch when Thomas passed too close. Ayana might stare too long when he reached for the rifle. Trust was fragile, but it was growing, and so were the questions. They never came all at once. Just small, quiet moments where silence felt heavier than words. One evening, as the wind whispered through the eaves and the fire crackled low, Nita was weaving a pouch from sinew thread near the fire. Thomas was patching the handle on a cooking pot. Tala lay curled in the loft, humming softly in a language that hung in the air like a ghost. And then, without looking up, Nita asked, "You had a wife?" Thomas froze. The pot in his lap felt heavier somehow. He didn't answer at first. Then slowly, he nodded. Yes. Ayana looked up from the fire. Nita pressed gently. "Where is she now?" The cabin grew still. Thomas cleared his throat, voice low and rough. "Gone. 2 winters ago. Childbirth." He didn't explain more than that. He didn't have to. Nita's eyes softened. "You buried her here." He nodded again. "Behind the cedar, her and the baby." Ayana turned away. Her jaw clenched. Thomas caught it. "I was gone too long," he murmured, more to himself than to them. "There was a blizzard. I thought I had more time. I went to Greystone for medicine. When I came back," he stopped. Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Tala shifted in the loft. "I dug the graves myself," he added, not knowing why. Didn't want anyone else touching them. The priest came later, said a few words, but it didn't matter. Ayana spoke for the first time in hours. "You stayed here, alone." Thomas nodded slowly. "Didn't see the point in leaving. I couldn't go back to town. Couldn't go forward." A long pause. Then, Ayana whispered something in Apache. Nita translated hesitantly. "She says, you chose to suffer alone." Thomas looked up, surprised. "She says, that's what men do when they don't know what else to do." He didn't answer. How could he? She was right. Ayana stood and walked outside without another word, disappearing into the snow-shadowed dusk. Nita looked at him, her expression unreadable. She lost people too. Not long ago. What happened? He asked quietly. Nita hesitated. Then she spoke, slow and careful. "We were with our band, south of the mountains. Soldiers came, said we had to move. Said it was law. Ayana's father tried to reason. Her brother tried to fight. Thomas already knew how that ended. They were killed," Nita said. "So we ran." She paused. Tala. She saw it all. Her mother too. Shot in the river while trying to carry her. Thomas closed his eyes. He had nothing to say to that. No words could carry the weight of what they'd seen, what they'd lost. "I'm sorry," he finally said, though it sounded so small. Nita gave him a quiet, tired smile. "We are all ghosts now. Only difference is, you made your home among them. We are still running." That night, the fire burned low, but none of them moved to add more wood. They sat in silence, each with their own memories playing behind their eyes. Outside, the forest breathed in the dark, a vast, indifferent witness. And for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel quite so alone in his grief. He was surrounded by survivors, not just of the cold, but of the world. The sun had returned to the forest, shy and pale as it filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the snow. The warmth was fleeting, but it stirred something in all of them, a feeling that winter, though still heavy, was beginning to loosen its grip. Thomas had started letting Ayana take his rifle on short hunts. She never asked. She just started, moving like she belonged out there, and she did. She returned with rabbits and once, a wild turkey. Slung over her shoulder like it was nothing, Tala had begun helping Nita with meal preparation. Though she still barely spoke to Thomas, her movements around him were more relaxed. She'd even handed him a tin cup of tea one morning without being asked, though she didn't meet his eyes. There were still moments of silence between them, but they no longer felt like walls. More like rest stops, quiet places between shared burdens. It was almost peaceful. Until the riders came. Thomas first heard them 2 days later while out near the creek, gathering saplings to patch a broken sled, hoofbeats faint but distinct crunching through old snow. Not regular traffic. Not neighbors. He crouched low, hiding among the brush. 3 men on horseback passed not 20 yards from him. Following the old hunting trail north, they were armed, rifles slung across their backs, pistols at their sides. One wore a cavalry coat, though it was torn and muddy. Another had a Confederate belt buckle, rusted but visible. The third had a bundle of something tied behind his saddle. Thomas narrowed his eyes. It was a pelt. No, not animal, hide. Hair. Braided, black, with beads still woven into it. His stomach turned. He waited until they were out of earshot before sprinting back to the cabin, faster than he'd run in years. "They're hunting," Ayana said when he described the men. Her jaw was tight, eyes blazing with a fire that Thomas hadn't seen before, controlled but dangerous. "Hunting?" he asked, though he already knew. "Us," she replied. Nita sat frozen near the fire, staring at her hands. Tala was silent. In the loft, Clutching the carved wooden horse, Thomas had made her like it was a talisman. Bounty hunters? He asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, Ayanna said. $20 for every scalp. 50 if they bring someone in alive. To Fort Morrow, Thomas felt sick. That's not legal anymore, he muttered. Ayanna raised her eyebrows. Legal doesn't matter out here. Only bullets and money. He stood and began pacing. We have to leave. They're headed north, but they'll come back. This trail loops around. Ayanna shook her head. Tala can't travel yet, and we don't know how many more there are. She's right, Nita said softly. They find us on the move. We die. Thomas stopped pacing. So what then? We wait here. No, Ayanna said. We prepare. The next 2 days passed in urgency. Gone was the slow rhythm of healing. In small talk, every motion now was deliberate. Every task part of a greater plan. Ayanna and Thomas reinforced the cabin's shutters with planks and nails. Nita boiled pitch to coat them extra fire protection. Tala, with help from Thomas, buried a stash of supplies in the woods behind the cabin. Food, clothes, and maps, in case they had to flee fast. Traps were set along the trail. Snares, tripwires, even a few old bear traps Thomas had stored away from his earlier trapping days. Ayanna taught him how to rig a simple but deadly spike trap using pine branches and sharpened sticks. They moved like a unit now. The mistrust was gone. Survival had bound them together more tightly than words ever could. That evening, as the sun bled orange through the trees, Thomas stood outside on the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the treeline. Ayanna joined him, quiet and steady. They will come, she said. He nodded. I know. She glanced at him. You could send us away. Say you never saw us, no shame in that. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the trail where the hoofprints had passed, then at the cabin, glowing warm behind them, filled with the smell of stew and fire. And finally at her. No, he said. I buried one family behind this house. I'm not going to stand by while someone tries to destroy another. Ayanna studied him. For the first time, she didn't look like she was assessing a threat, she looked like she saw something familiar. Then we fight. The air changed. Not in temperature, though it remained bitterly cold, but in weight. Everything felt heavier. The silence between the trees was no longer peaceful, it was expectant. The forest was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, life became a war dance. They had maybe 2 or 3 days, Thomas estimated, before the bounty hunters came back around. Maybe less. If they were tracking, he and Ayanna had covered the earlier hoofprints with pine boughs and led false trails out toward the western ridge. But if the men had dogs, it wouldn't be enough, so they prepared not just for escape, but for a fight. Thomas dug up his father's old double-barrel shotgun from the storage trunk under the floorboards. He'd buried it there the day Clara died, swearing never to use it again. Now he cleaned it with steady hands. Ayanna watched him in silence, her own rifle beside her. She checked its sighting, then loaded her last handful of cartridges. 6 shots, she said. Thomas nodded. I've got 8 in the shotgun, 30 in the Winchester. Make them count. Meanwhile, Nita turned the cabin into a defensive haven. She soaked old rags in bear grease and wrapped them around glass bottles, makeshift firebombs. Thomas had never seen that trick before, but Nita had. From the Chiricahua, she explained, used them against patrols in the canyon. Tala set tripwires outside, using wire from an old snare and metal pans for alarms. She didn't speak much, but her hands moved quickly, confidently. She knew what she was doing. The 4 of them were no longer just housemates or refugees. They were a unit. They took turns sleeping in shifts. Ayanna insisted on the midnight watch. Thomas took the pre-dawn hours. Every night, one of them stood on the porch with a rifle and a lantern, eyes trained on the dark trees. Do you think they'll come at night? Tala asked softly one evening, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. No, Ayanna said. Men like that prefer to see what they kill. Tala's eyes narrowed. Cowards. Thomas looked at her and nodded. You're not wrong. Amid the tension, something strange happened. They laughed, not often, but enough. One afternoon, while preparing pine pitch for the traps, Thomas accidentally set his glove on fire. He panicked, waving it wildly in the air, until Ayanna tackled him into the snow to smother the flames. When they got up, both coughing, Tala burst into laughter, pure, uncontrolled, and unexpected. Nita joined in, covering her mouth as she giggled. Even Ayanna smiled. Thomas, lying flat in the snow, grinned up at the sky. Glad I could bring some joy to the apocalypse. Later that evening, while Nita was braiding Tala's hair and Ayanna cleaned weapons near the fire, Thomas sat at the table and unfolded a map. I've been thinking, he said, tapping a region near the southern ridge. There's an old trail through Harlan Pass. It's narrow, but if we had to get out fast, it's the best route. They won't expect it. Ayanna joined him, scanning the map. You know the land well. I've lived here over a decade. These woods raised me. You ever used that trail? Once, with Clara. Her name hung in the air, like a soft bell. Ayanna didn't flinch at it. She must have been strong. Thomas nodded. She had to be. She married me. A small chuckle passed between them. Then silence. then something else, a kind of understanding. Like two rivers slowly converging. You didn't have to take us in, Ayanna said. No, Thomas agreed, but I'm glad I did. That night, Thomas stepped outside during his shift and stood under the stars. The moon was half full, casting silver across the snow. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. He listened. Nothing. No hoofbeats, no snapping branches, no men, but still, he felt them. Out there coming. He turned as the cabin door opened, and Ayanna stepped out, wrapped in a blanket, rifle slung over her shoulder. You should sleep, she said. I will. They stood side by side, looking into the woods. We'll be ready, Thomas said. Ayanna nodded. We have to be. The wind carried the sound before the men appeared. A faint jingle of tack, the slow creak of saddle leather, the steady crunch of hooves pressing into frost-hardened snow. Thomas crouched at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the cabin, his Winchester steady in his hands. Ayanna lay prone in the brush nearby, rifle sighted, body still as stone. Behind them, Nita waited just inside the cabin with Tala, who was crouched near the kitchen window. Firebombs lined up beside her like glass eggs of fury. The trap was set. Now it was just a question of whether the men would walk into it, or burn everything down. Trying. 3 of them rode into view. Same men Thomas had seen before. The one in front wore the cavalry coat, now dusted with snow. He had a cruel sun-leathered face and cold eyes that scanned the cabin like a man surveying a carcass. His name, they'd learned from Tala's memory, was Reckon Callum, a known bounty hunter turned Apache runner after the army started paying for scalps under the table. The other 2 were smaller, twitchier, one young and pale, the other wiry and mean-looking with a scar across his lip. They carried long guns and wore pistols strapped high on their thighs. They pulled their horses to a stop 30 yards from the cabin. Callum raised his voice. Hello, the cabin. We're looking for 3 strays come out of the reservation near Red Clay. Heard they might be traveling north. Silence, he smiled, as if pleased by it. Thomas exhaled slowly. Come on now, Callum called again, voice syrupy. Ain't looking for trouble. Just want a word. You got nothing to hide. No reason to be shy. Inside the cabin, Tala whispered something in Apache. Nita replied, equally quiet. He's lying. Thomas stood. He stepped out from behind the trees, rifle casually slung in front of him, boots crunching in the snow. You're trespassing, he called. Don't recall inviting visitors. Callum grinned wide. Well, hell, there you are. Didn't mean no offense, mister. Just figured you might have seen something. Thomas kept his face blank. I haven't. Scarlip shifted in his saddle. You sure? They're worth good money if you did. 50 apiece. Last I heard. Callum shot him a glare. Shut up. Thomas's eyes didn't move from Callum. You just admitted to hunting people for money. Callum shrugged. It's the frontier. Everything's for sale. Thomas took a step closer. Not here. The 2 sides stared at each other across the snow, the air between them crackling like firewood in a hot stove. Then Callum's eyes narrowed. You ain't from Greystone, are you? I've lived here longer than anyone in that town. Then you know what people like them bring. Raids, retaliation, blood. This ain't a game. You hide them, you die with them. Thomas's jaw tensed. Inside the cabin, Tala struck flint. 2 wick, 1 firebomb lit, gently glowing like a promise. Ayanna adjusted her aim. Her rifle was pointed directly at Callum's chest. Thomas said, clearly and coldly, there's a grave behind this house. I'll gladly dig 3 more if I have to. That was the moment the wind died. Callum's smile vanished. His hand twitched toward his pistol. Ayanna fired first. The shot rang through the forest like a lightning crack. Callum's shoulder jerked violently as the bullet slammed into him, spinning him half off his horse. Before the others could react, Thomas fired 2 shots, fast. One hit Scarlip's chest, and he dropped like a sack of wheat. The pale one turned to run. Panicked, but his horse reared from the noise and threw him hard into the snow. From the cabin window, Nita hurled the lit firebomb. It exploded near the 3rd man, who screamed and rolled, his coat ablaze. Thomas advanced, weapon raised. Don't move, he barked. The man writhed, coughing in the smoke, arms over his head. Behind him, Ayanna emerged from the trees, calm and silent, rifle still warm in her hands. Callum groaned, blood leaking from his shoulder. He tried to stand, but Ayanna was on him in 2 strides. She kicked his pistol away and stared down at him. He looked up, pale and sweating. You're just a squaw. She hit him, hard, with the butt of her rifle. He went limp. Later, when the bodies were buried far from the cabin and the firebomb ashes doused, the 4 of them sat in the snow, quiet and shaking. They were alive. No. One spoke for a long time. Then Tala, looking down at the broken rifle in her lap, whispered, we didn't run. Ayanna touched her shoulder gently. No, we didn't. Thomas stared out into the trees. They would come again, but next time, they'd know this wasn't just a cabin. It was a line in the snow, and he wasn't standing alone anymore. The snow absorbed the blood. The trees swallowed the smoke, and the world, as it always did, kept on turning. After the fight, the forest seemed quieter, not peaceful, but watchful. the kind of quiet that came after violence, when nature held its breath and waited to see what would grow from the ashes. Thomas buried the dead men far beyond the clearing, under frozen soil that fought him with every shovel of dirt. Ayanna helped. Neither spoke during the task. There was no need. They both knew that justice in these parts was a cold, crooked thing. It didn't arrive with lawmen or judges. It came with a rifle and resolve. By the third day, the smell of gunpowder had faded, replaced by the familiar scent of pine and smoke. But the tension in the cabin remained. They all knew this wasn't over. That evening, a red glow appeared on the horizon southwest of the cabin, where the old ridgeline met the edge of reservation land. Nita was the first to see it. She stepped onto the porch, just after dusk, and stared for a long moment, saying nothing. Thomas joined her, followed by Ayanna. Tala crept out last, her eyes wide. The light wasn't natural. Not moonlight, not sunset. It was fire, a far-off inferno. Ayanna squinted, too big to be campfire. Thomas frowned. Looks like buildings, or a village. Red clay, Nita asked, almost in a whisper. They all knew the answer. Later, Ayanna confirmed it. She returned from a scouting mission at dawn, eyes red, jaw clenched. They burned it, she said. Red clay is gone. Smoke still rising. Cattle shot, shelters destroyed. No signs of survivors. Tala gasped, everyone. Ayanna nodded slowly. It was soldiers, maybe bounty hunters too. But they didn't come for negotiation. They came to erase. Thomas felt his stomach twist. He remembered Clara's stories about burned fields during the Warhol communities vanished overnight. He thought that part of history had ended. Apparently not. What about the others from your band? He asked. Ayanna hesitated. Some may have fled east, she said, if they were lucky. And if not, Thomas asked. Her silence was answer enough. That night, the firelight inside the cabin cast long shadows across their faces. No one spoke for a while. They ate quietly smoked fish, boiled root vegetables, stale bread. The mood was heavy, haunted. Eventually, Thomas broke the silence. We can't stay here. Nita looked up. You mean run? No, not just run. He looked at each of them in turn. We leave. Yes, but with purpose. We find the others. If they're alive, they need help. If they're scattered, they need leaders. Ayanna's brow furrowed. You would come with us. Thomas nodded. I know these lands. I know where to hide, where to travel, where not to. You need that. Tala narrowed her eyes. And what do you need? He didn't hesitate. Redemption. That silenced the room again. Not because they doubted him, but because they all understood. Every one of them was carrying ghosts. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to carry them alone anymore. Over the next 3 days, they prepared again, but this time, not for battle, for movement, for escape, for resistance. They packed lightly dried meats, cured hides, salt, flint, needles, thread. Ayanna mapped the safest trails east and south, away from known patrols. Thomas marked the high ground, the old mines, the stream beds no one used anymore. Nita and Tala preserved everything edible they could find. Tala insisted on bringing the carved wooden horse. Thomas tucked it into her satchel without a word. They dismantled parts of the cabin, burning papers, hiding tools, scattering ashes. If soldiers came, they would find nothing useful. Just a broken house in the woods. On the final night, they sat around the hearth in silence, watching the flames. I'll miss this place, Nita said quietly. So will I, Thomas replied. But it served its purpose. It gave us time, Ayanna added, and choice. Tala didn't say anything, but she reached out and took Thomas's hand. He didn't let go at dawn. They left the cabin behind. Thomas paused at the graves beneath the cedar. Clara's and the baby's. He knelt, touched the cold stone, then stood. I'll be back, he whispered. When it's safe. Then he turned and walked into the trees. Following the others, the fire in the distance had faded, but another had ignited in their hearts, not of destruction, but of resistance. The forest was waking. Birds called softly through the frostbitten branches. A thin mist curled like smoke over the trail ahead, tracing the footsteps they would follow. Thomas led the way, moving quietly but with purpose. Behind him, Ayanna scanned the horizon, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Nita carried the supplies with practiced ease, and Tala walked beside Thomas, clutching the carved wooden horse close to her chest. They had left the cabin and the ghosts buried beneath the cedar, far behind. Ahead was uncertainty, but also hope. The days grew longer, and the thaw came slowly. Snow turned to slush, then to muddy patches, then to soft earth dotted with the first green shoots of spring. Each step was measured. They avoided roads and settlements, sticking to forgotten paths and hidden valleys. When they encountered signs of life trails worn by hunters or smoke from distant fires, they moved cautiously, retreating if necessary. At night, Thomas would teach Tala the stars, showing her the patterns that guided travelers through the wilderness. He told her stories of his youth, of wild rivers, endless forests, and the time before loss. Slowly, trust deepened. One evening, by a quiet stream, Ayanna pointed to a distant ridge bathed in golden light. There, she said softly, That's where they are. The others looked up. Barely visible through the trees was a cluster of tents, smoke curling from a central fire. A band of survivors, scattered but alive, eking out a fragile existence. Thomas swallowed hard. They were home. As they approached the camp, they were met with wary eyes and silent weapons. But when Thomas stepped forward and spoke in a calm, steady voice, the tension eased. "I bring others," he said. "We come for shelter, for protection, for a chance to rebuild." A tall man with a weathered face stepped out. He studied Thomas carefully. "A man who stands with Apache," he said finally, "is a man we can trust." The camp slowly opened its arms. Over the following weeks, Thomas, Ayana, Nita, and Tala worked alongside the others to strengthen the camp's defenses and build new homes from timber and stone. They shared stories, food, and laughter, a fragile but fierce community taking root. Thomas found himself becoming more than a survivor. He was a protector, a guide, a friend. He looked at Ayana one evening, the setting sun casting fire in her eyes, and knew this journey, painful as it was, had changed him. For the first time in years, he believed in tomorrow, but the road ahead was long. They all knew soldiers and bounty hunters still roamed the frontier, hungry for power, money, and control. They would come again. But now, Thomas and the women were ready. Together they would face whatever the wilderness and the world threw at them. They were no longer just victims, they were warriors. Under the vast sky, with the scent of pine and smoke in the air, Thomas knelt beside the new graves of those lost along the way, fallen friends and family. He vowed never to forget. He pressed the carved wooden horse into the earth beside them, a symbol of hope and remembrance. As night settled, the stars shone brighter than ever, guiding them forward.